The steps of Lindenhurst House were lit that October evening with a double row of glass lanterns, and though the wind carried the first true chill of autumn across the drive, no one arriving for the Duchess of Reresby's ball seemed inclined to hurry indoors. For there was more to be observed upon the gravel than there would be within the ballroom. Carriages arrived in a slow and stately procession, each disgorging its passengers before the wide stone steps, and it was there, at the very top, beneath the lanterns, that the Duke of Alderley paused with a woman upon his arm who was not his wife, and said, in a voice pitched to carry, "Move aside for her." He did not raise his voice to say it. He did not need to. The words fell into a silence that had already begun to gather, for the guests behind him had seen what he apparently had not troubled himself to notice, that his own wife, the Duchess of Alderley, stood not 3 steps below him, her hand still lifted from the arm of the footman who had helped her down from her carriage, waiting, as she had waited for a great many things over the 3 years of her marriage, for her husband to acknowledge her before he swept past. Mrs. Vivienne Colfax, resplendent in amber silk that caught the lantern light like something poured rather than woven, did not look at the Duchess at all. She looked only at the door, and at the room beyond it, and at the version of the evening she intended to have. Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Alderley, looked at neither of them. She looked, instead, at the space her husband had just asked her to vacate, and then, without haste, without a word of protest, without so much as a change in the set of her shoulders, she stepped aside. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a great many people pretending not to have heard something they would discuss for a fortnight. Julian Vane, Duke of Alderley, did not appear to register it. He continued up the steps with Mrs. Colfax on his arm, and the door of Lindenhurst House opened to receive them. And for a moment Eleanor remained exactly where she had been asked to stand, her gloved hands folded before her, her chin very slightly lifted, while 200 candles' worth of light spilled out around the pair ascending into it. Then she turned to the footman who had handed her down not 2 minutes before, and said, in a voice as level as if she were requesting more tea, "Have my carriage brought back around, if you please." The footman, who was young and had not yet learned to arrange his face into the blankness the older servants wore like livery, glanced up toward the door through which his master had just vanished, and then back at the Duchess, and something in her expression, not distress, not even anger, but a kind of finished quiet, stopped whatever he might have said. "At once, your Grace," he said, and went. She did not weep in the carriage, though the coachman, who had known her since her wedding and loved her with the particular fierce loyalty of a servant who has watched a mistress endure more than she ought, would have forgiven her if she had. She sat instead with her hands folded in her lap, and watched the lanterns of Lindenhurst House recede through the small back window, and thought, with the detachment of someone examining a wound days after the injury rather than in the moment of it, that she was not, in fact, surprised. She had been married to Julian Vane for 3 years, and for 2 of those years she had watched him grow more distant by degrees so small she could never point to the hour it had begun. The way a room grows cold before one thinks to notice the fire has gone out. She had known, in the manner one knows a thing without permitting oneself to examine it too closely, that Vivienne Colfax's return to society 18 months prior, widowed, wealthy, and unaccountably more beautiful than memory ought to have allowed her to be, had reopened something in her husband that their marriage had never been asked to heal. because their marriage had never been founded upon any expectation of love in the first place. She had married him for reasons that were at the time entirely sensible. Her father, Sir Robert Hartwell, had died leaving debts that would have taken the roof from over her mother's head, and the new Duke of Alderley, only recently elevated by his own brother's death, and in want of a wife whose dowry would not further strain an estate already staggering under his late brother's mismanagement, had offered a match that solved both their difficulties with the tidy efficiency of a well-drawn contract. There had been no pretense of affection on either side. She had gone into the marriage with her eyes open, telling herself, in the manner of sensible young women who have read too little poetry and too many household accounts, that affection might grow where duty was faithfully tended, as ivy will take a wall given time and a little rain. It had not grown. It had, if anything, retreated, and she had watched it retreat with the particular grief of a woman who cannot name what she has lost, because she was never permitted to claim it as hers in the first place. Larkspur Hall lay some 6 miles beyond the boundary of the Alderley home estate, a modest manor of grey stone that had come to her as part of her marriage settlement, a dower property assigned to her almost as an afterthought amid the more substantial business of dowries and jointures. And in 3 years she had visited it perhaps 4 times, always briefly, always as a formality. It had been let to a tenant farmer's family for the first year of her marriage and left empty since. And when her own carriage turned up its overgrown drive 2 mornings after the ball at Lindenhurst House, with 3 trunks strapped behind, and her lady's maid, Peggy, dozing fitfully against the window, Eleanor looked upon the house's shuttered windows and sagging east gable with something that was not quite dismay. It was rather the particular clarity of a woman assessing a problem she intends to solve. She had spent 3 years learning to run a great household without ever being permitted to feel it was truly hers to run, deferring at every turn to a housekeeper who answered, in matters of any consequence, to her husband's steward rather than to her. She had balanced accounts she was not asked to keep, and organised a still room whose recipes she had not been consulted on adopting. She had, in short, spent 3 years being competent in a house that never once required her competence to be seen. Larkspur Hall, neglected and half derelict as it was, asked for nothing else. The steward who came to meet her that first morning, a stooped, grey-whiskered man named Mr. Fenwick, who had been left in nominal charge of the property, and had, by his own quiet admission, done little more than collect what rents he could and let the rest slide, seemed astonished that the Duchess had come at all, and more astonished still when she asked, before she had even removed her bonnet, to see the estate ledgers. "They are not much to look at, Your Grace," he warned her, in the tone of a man apologising for a room rather than a set of figures, and he was not wrong. The accounts, when she spread them across the dusty desk in what had once been the estate office, told a story of neglect compounding upon neglect, of repairs deferred until they became emergencies, of a drainage system in the low fields that had not been cleared in a decade and now flooded 3 tenant cottages with every hard rain, of rents forgiven in some years and demanded in full in others, with no apparent logic beyond whichever tenant Mr. Fenwick's predecessor had found easiest to intimidate. She read the ledgers by the light of a single tallow candle until well past midnight, and by morning she had made a list, in her own small, decisive hand, of everything that wanted doing, beginning with the drainage in the low fields, for she had grown up on her father's modest estate before his debts had swallowed it, and knew in her bones that a house cannot be set right while its foundations stand in water. The tenants of Larkspur, who had grown accustomed to a landlord who never came and an agent who came only to collect, regarded their new mistress with a wariness that took the better part of a month to soften. She won them the way she had always won difficult things, not with grand gestures, but with steady, visible labour. She walked the low fields herself in stout boots that ruined 2 pairs of stockings. She sat at the kitchen table of the widow Hollis and worked out, penny by penny, what rent the woman could actually afford to pay, rather than what the old agent had been demanding of her. She dismissed the agent entirely within a fortnight of her arrival, over Mr. Fenwick's nervous protestations when she discovered he had been pocketing the difference between what tenants paid and what he reported to the estate. Word of these things travelled the way word travels in the countryside, from kitchen to kitchen, and market stall to market stall, faster and further than any letter. And it was not many weeks before Sir Edmund Locke, a widower of good land and better manners, whose own estate marched alongside Larkspur's northern boundary, called at the hall to introduce himself properly. Having heard, he said, that the new mistress of Larkspur had settled a dispute over a boundary ditch more fairly in an afternoon than his own father's solicitors had managed in 10 years. He was perhaps 40, silver already threading his dark hair, and he possessed the unhurried courtesy of a man who had nothing left to prove to the world, and therefore no need to perform for it. He called again the following week, ostensibly to discuss the boundary ditch further, and again the week after that. And though Eleanor received him with the same open, unguarded friendliness she gave to Mr. Fenwick or to the widow Hollis, he began by slow and careful degrees to hope for something more than friendship, and did not entirely trouble to hide it. She told him, gently, that she was a married woman, and he told her, with the same gentleness, that he was aware of it, and that he asked nothing of her beyond her continued acquaintance, which was, in its way, a kind of honesty she had grown unaccustomed to receiving from men. She did not love him. She was honest enough with herself to know that what she felt in his company was something closer to relief. The relief of being looked at plainly, without calculation, by someone who wanted nothing from her that she had not already offered. And she was honest enough, too, to recognize that this relief was itself a kind of quiet indictment of the marriage she had left behind. The test of her competence, when it came, arrived not as a comfortable proof, but as a genuine emergency, in the form of a November storm that broke over the district with a violence the oldest tenants swore they had not seen in 30 years. 3 days of unbroken rain that swelled the stream feeding the low fields until it burst its banks well past midnight and sent brown water pouring toward the very cottages whose new drainage had, until that hour, been holding admirably. Fenwick came pounding at the hall's door near 2 in the morning, half drowned himself and white, with the particular fear of a man who believes disaster has outrun every precaution taken against it, and Eleanor was dressed and out of doors within a quarter hour, lantern in hand, giving orders with a steadiness that Fenwick would describe for years afterward as the thing that had turned a catastrophe into merely a very bad night. She had the widow Hollis and her children brought up to the hall itself before the water reached the cottage door, would not permit the men to attempt the ford at the old mill crossing where the current ran fastest, redirected them instead to the higher bridge a half-mile upstream, though it cost them precious time, judged correctly, from her weeks of walking those fields, exactly where the new drainage channel would hold and where it would not, and stood in the rain until past dawn, directing the placement of sandbags cut from grain sacks at the one point in the system she judged most likely to fail, which held, in the end, though barely, sparing the 3 cottages that would certainly have flooded under the old drainage and had flooded every hard winter for a decade before her arrival. By the time the rain broke, near mid-morning, she had not slept in over 30 hours, and her boots, Peggy reported later with a kind of appalled admiration, were quite beyond any hope of salvage. But not a single tenant family had lost so much as a roof timber, and the story of the night the new Duchess stood in the flood, directing men twice her size where to lay sandbags, travelled through the district a good deal faster and further than any account of her ledgers ever had. Reaching Sir Edmund within the day, and reaching, in due course, by the same servants' channels that carried every piece of country intelligence eventually to every interested party. The ears of the household at Alderley as well, where it was received, though no one remarked upon it aloud in the Duke's hearing, with a quiet and general satisfaction that the old agent's flooding problem had been solved at last, and solved by the one person no one at Alderley had thought to credit with the capacity for it. At Alderley, in the weeks that followed the ball at Lindenhurst House, the great house settled into a silence that its butler, Miss Pruitt, who had served the family for 32 years and had buried the old Duke and welcomed the new one, and watched 3 duchesses come and go in his time, if one counted the Duke's mother and grandmother among them, found more unsettling than any open quarrel could have been. The Duchess's chair at the foot of the long table stood empty. Her private sitting-room, which she had furnished sparely but with evident care, its shelves lined with account-books, and a single vase that was kept, by standing order she had left with the housekeeper, always filled with whatever flowers the season allowed, remained shut up and unused, though the housekeeper, out of some stubbornness Mr. Pruitt privately admired, continued to change the flowers regardless. Mrs. Colfax, meanwhile, began to comport herself about the house with an ease that unsettled the staff more than any explicit command could have done, rearranging the flowers in the front hall to her own taste, questioning the housekeeper about menus in a manner that presumed an authority no one had granted her, and it was this presumption, more than any single scandalous word, that turned the household's private sympathies decisively toward its absent mistress. Servants notice what their employers assume they do not. Mr. Pruitt, in particular, noticed that his Grace had taken, in recent weeks, to standing at the window of his study late into the evening, looking out across the dark park toward the road that led eventually to Larkspur, though he said nothing of it to anyone, and gave no sign by day that he thought of his wife at all. It was Lady Ophelia Vane, the Duke's aunt, a woman of 70 years and a tongue that had outlasted every fashion for delicacy, who first said aloud in his hearing what the rest of the household had only permitted themselves to think. She arrived at Alderley, unannounced some 6 weeks after the ball, took one look at the flowers in the front hall arranged in a style she pronounced, with withering precision, entirely too eager for a house whose mistress is not in residence, and demanded to see her nephew alone. "I will not pretend to you, Julian, that I do not know precisely what has happened," she said once the study door was shut, "for the whole of London knows it, and has known it these 6 weeks, and has been remarkably restrained by London standards in not saying so to your face. He began some reply about the ordinary complexities of a long acquaintance renewed, about old friendship and the awkwardness of society's assumptions, and she cut him off with the particular impatience of a woman who had watched him take his first steps, and saw no reason to grant him more dignity now than she had granted him then. "Old friendship," she said. "Is that what we are calling it? Let me tell you something of your old friendship, since you have evidently permitted yourself to forget it. Vivienne Colfax did not have her heart broken by circumstance when she married Mr. Colfax 11 years ago. She wrote to her cousin, my own goddaughter, not a fortnight before the wedding, boasting, Julian, that she had done very well for herself in securing a man of 12,000 a year over a second son with no immediate prospects and a brother in indifferent health. I have that letter still, if you wish to see it, though I confess I have not the stomach to watch you read it." He said nothing. "You have spent 11 years grieving a woman who did not grieve you for a fortnight." Lady Ophelia went on, more gently now, for she was not a cruel woman, only an honest one, and in the process you have humiliated a wife who has done nothing in 3 years but exactly what was asked of her, and rather more besides, from what I hear of Larkspur. He looked up at that. "You have heard of Larkspur." "The whole county has heard of Larkspur," she said. "Your wife has done more for that estate in 2 months than has been done in 10 years, and done it, from what I am told, with her own 2 hands in the mud of the low fields. There is a woman worth moving aside for, Julian, if moving aside is the fashion in this family now." She left him with that, and with the letter, which she had in fact brought with her, and which he did not open for 3 days, and then read only once, standing at the window of his study, before he set it down and did not speak of it to anyone. He spent a great many of the evenings that followed in the particular uncomfortable labour of re-examining a history he had spent 11 years content to leave unexamined. He had told himself, across the whole of his young manhood, a simple and flattering story that he had loved once, truly and irrecoverably, and had been robbed of that love by circumstance, and that everything since, the dutiful courtship of Eleanor Hartwell, the business-like affection he had permitted their marriage, the careful management of an estate he had inherited in disorder, had been the sensible conduct of a man who had already spent the best of his feeling and had only competence left to offer. It was a story that excused a great deal, he saw now, sitting alone in his study with Lady Ophelia's letter unread beside him for the better part of 3 days before he could bring himself to open it, precisely because it asked nothing further of him. A man who believes his capacity for love permanently spent need never trouble himself to examine whether he is extending to his present wife the ordinary attentions any decent marriage requires. He thought of small things, turning them over with the same unsparing attention Eleanor had once turned upon Larkspur's tangled ledgers, the anniversary of their wedding which he had marked the year past, with nothing more than a formal note sent up with her breakfast tray while he rode out early to avoid the awkwardness of the day. The evening, some 18 months into the marriage, when she had asked, with a diffidence he had not troubled to notice at the time, whether he might care to hear how the household accounts stood, and he had told her he trusted her judgment entirely, which had felt, in the moment, like a compliment, and which he understood now, examined honestly, to have been simply another way of not attending to her at all. He had mistaken the absence of complaint for the absence of injury, and had done so, He admitted to himself at last, because it was a great deal more comfortable than the alternative. When he finally opened Lady Ophelia's letter and read Vivienne's 11-year-old boast in her own careless hand, the shock of it was smaller than he had expected, and duller. And what remained afterward was not grief for a lost love so much as a kind of embarrassment at how long he had permitted a fiction to stand in place of a fact he might have discovered for himself at any point in the intervening years, had he ever cared to ask. It was Cora who did more than any letter to unmake the careful distance he had built around the subject of his wife. Cora Vane was 11 years old, the Duke's much younger half-sister and, since their mother's death 2 years past, his ward, a solemn, watchful child who noticed a great deal more than the adults around her generally credited her with noticing, and who had loved Eleanor without reservation from the first week of the marriage, when the new Duchess had taken the trouble to ask her, seriously and at length, what she thought of her governess, rather than simply informing her what she was to think. Cora had wept in private over the emptiness of Eleanor's sitting-room, and had, without asking anyone's leave, begun contriving reasons why her lessons required a drive past Larkspur's gates, until at last she simply asked her brother outright whether she might visit her sister, and he, unable to construct a reasonable objection that did not require him to explain himself, said that she might, so long as Peggy or her governess accompanied her. She went every week thereafter, and returned each time brimming with reports that she delivered to her brother over supper with the guileless thoroughness of a child who has not yet learned that some information is meant to wound. Aunt Eleanor had built a new gate for the water meadow. Aunt Eleanor had taught her to identify which fields drained badly by the colour of the rushes that grew there. Aunt Eleanor had a dog now, a spaniel called Marigold that the widow Hollis's boy had given her in gratitude for the new roof on their cottage. Aunt Eleanor laughed a great deal more at Larkspur than she ever had at Alderley, Cora observed one evening, with the devastating bluntness of the very young, and then asked, into the silence that followed, "Why did you make her go away, Julian?" He had no answer that satisfied even himself, and told her only that it was a complicated matter between grown persons, which Cora received with the visible scepticism of a child who suspects, correctly, that grown persons frequently use the word complicated to avoid saying something simple and unflattering. The public test came, as such things generally do, at an event neither party had particularly wished to attend, but neither could well avoid, the county's harvest assembly, held that year at the Reresby Assembly Rooms in the market town. An occasion at which the great families of the district and the lesser gentry alike gathered to dance and to gossip and to display, with varying degrees of subtlety, precisely where they stood with one another. Eleanor attended at Sir Edmund's invitation, and wore, for the first time since her removal to Larkspur, a gown that was not simply practical, a deep green silk that Peggy had altered from an old one rather than ordered new, for the estate's accounts, restored to health as they were, still wanted every spare shilling for the tenant cottages. Julian attended because a duke does not absent himself from the principal social occasion of his own county without inviting precisely the sort of speculation he had spent 2 months trying to outlast, and he brought Mrs. Colfax, because to have left her behind so publicly would have been in its own way as loud a statement as bringing her had been at Lindenhurst House, and he had not yet found the resolve to make that statement plainly. It was Mrs. Colfax herself, flushed with wine and with the particular confidence of a woman who has begun to believe her position more secure than it is, who forced the matter into the open. She had been speaking within Eleanor's hearing, and Eleanor suspected quite deliberately so, of the unfortunate tendency of some women to lower themselves to the level of their tenants, to go about with mud on their hands and their hems, mistaking labour for accomplishment, when a lady's true accomplishment lay in knowing how to be looked at rather than how to dig a ditch. "I understand the Duchess has become quite the farmer," she said, to the small circle that had gathered near the punch table, with a laugh that invited the circle to laugh with her. One wonders whether Larkspur wants a mistress or a labourer. Several of the assembled company laughed, uncertainly, watching to see which way the wind would blow, for a jest at the expense of a duchess is a dangerous thing to laugh at until one knows the Duke's opinion of it. Julian, who had been standing near enough to hear every word, set down his glass. He did not raise his voice any more than he had at Lindenhurst House, but where his words on that earlier evening had cut one way, they now cut decisively the other. "The tenants of Larkspur's low fields," he said, into the small silence Mrs. Colfax's laughter had left behind, "were flooded out of their homes 3 winters running before my wife took the estate in hand. Their cottages are dry this year for the first time in a decade, because she walked those fields herself and found the fault in the drainage that 2 paid agents before her had missed or ignored. I am not aware," he went on, with a level courtesy that was somehow more damning than anger would have been, "that there is any accomplishment in being looked at that compares to that." The silence that followed this was of an entirely different character than the one that had followed Mrs. Colfax's jest, and it was Sir Edmund, standing near Eleanor with the easy loyalty of a man defending a friend, who broke it by remarking, mildly, that he had walked those same fields himself, and found the Duchess's work on them the most sensible piece of estate management he had seen in the county in 20 years, which had the effect of settling the matter, socially speaking, rather more thoroughly than Julian's own defence had managed alone, for it came from a disinterested quarter and could not be dismissed as a husband's obligatory loyalty. Mrs. Colfax's smile did not waver, but something behind it had gone very still, and within the week word reached Alderley, by the usual servants' channels that carried such intelligence faster than any post, that several of the invitations she had been counting upon for the coming season had been quietly withdrawn. He rode to Larkspur 3 evenings later, alone, without sending word ahead. A decision he had turned over in his mind for the better part of those 3 days, and had very nearly abandoned a dozen times before he finally gave the order to have his horse saddled. It was full dark by the time he reached the boundary where Larkspur's land met his own, marked by nothing more than a low stone wall and a gate that had, in his father's time, and his brothers after him, always stood wired shut, the 2 estates having conducted their business, when they had any, through solicitors rather than through any more direct traffic. He saw, as he came along the boundary road, a single lamp burning in the window of what he knew, from Cora's reports, to be the estate office, and he understood, with a small shock of recognition, that he had in fact seen that same lamp before, on other evenings, from the window of his own study, without ever permitting himself to name what he was looking at or why he found himself looking. He left his horse at the gate and walked the rest of the way up the darkened drive on foot, and it was Mr. Fenwick, roused by the knock, who let him in and went, with visible apprehension, to inform the Duchess that her husband had come. She received him in the estate office rather than in any more formal room, because it was where she had been sitting when Fenwick came to tell her, and because, she told herself, there was no reason to grant the occasion more ceremony than it warranted. She did not rise from behind the desk when he entered, though she set down her pen. The ledger before her lay open to a column of figures she had been reconciling, and the lamp between them threw a small, steady circle of light that left both their faces half in shadow. "Your Grace," she said, and the formality of it, delivered without heat, landed harder than any reproach could have done. "Eleanor," he said, and then, hearing how it sounded, unearned and too familiar, corrected himself. "Your Grace. I have come to say something to you, and I find, now that I am here, that I do not know how to begin it in a manner that does not sound like an excuse, and so I will simply say it plainly, and allow you to judge it as you will. I was wrong. Not merely at Lindenhurst House, though I was most wrong there, but for a great deal longer than that evening, in a great many smaller ways that I permitted myself not to examine, because examining them would have required me to admit what they amounted to." She said nothing, and he took her silence, correctly, as an instruction to continue. "You will have heard, I imagine, some part of the history between myself and Mrs. Colfax. I have heard a great deal of it," Eleanor said, "though I confess I had assumed most of it to be a decade old, and therefore no longer any business of mine." "It was a decade old," he said. "I have only lately learned how little of what I believed about it was true. I loved her, or believed I did, when I was 26 and a second son, with no expectation of ever inheriting anything worth the name. And when she married elsewhere for a fortune I could not then offer her, I told myself for 11 years that I had lost something rare, and I let that story stand unexamined, because examining it would have cost me something I was not prepared to pay. When she returned to society a widow, I did not fall in love with her again, Your Grace. I fell in love with the grief I had been carrying, and mistook the relief of finally being permitted to indulge it for something it was not. That is not an excuse. It is only, I think, the truth of it, and you are owed the truth more than you are owed anything else I might say to you tonight." Eleanor rose then, and came around the desk, not toward him, but to the window, where she stood looking out at the dark shape of the garden wall that marked the edge of her small domain. "Do you know," she said, "what I told myself 3 years ago when I agreed to marry you? I told myself that affection might grow where duty was faithfully tended. I did not expect love. Precisely, I had read enough sensible books to know better than to expect it of an arranged match. But I believed. I permitted myself to believe, because the alternative was too bleak to sit with for 4 years of engagement negotiations and a wedding and everything after, that I might in time come to matter to you. Not as a wife matters to a household, in the sense of accounts kept and heirs produced, but as a person matters to another person. I do not think I ever said this aloud to anyone, not even to Peggy, because saying it aloud would have made the disappointment, when it came, harder to bear with any dignity. And did it come? He asked, quietly. You know that it did, she said. I watched you grow distant by such small degrees that I could never accuse you of any single unkindness, only of an accumulation of them, until the evening you asked me, in front of 200 people, to move aside for a woman you had not troubled to tell me you were still entangled with. I did not weep in the carriage home, your grace, though I believe you may have expected it of me. I found instead that I was almost relieved, because at last I understood plainly what I had for 2 years only suspected, and a plain understanding, however painful, is easier to build upon than a hope one dares not examine. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had lost the careful evenness he had carried into the room. "I do not ask you to forgive me tonight," he said. "I am not certain I would trust myself if you did, so quickly, and after so little proof of any change in me beyond a few words spoken in an office by lamplight. But I would ask you to permit me to earn it, however long that takes. And I would ask you to believe that I understand now what I did not understand 3 years ago, or even 3 months ago, which is that you were never the lesser bargain in this marriage, your grace. You were the better part of it, and I have spent 3 years too occupied with an old grief to notice." She turned from the window to look at him then, and something in her face, which had held so carefully composed through the whole of the conversation, wavered very slightly before she mastered it again. "I do not know how to simply be told this and trust it," she said. "I have been sensible for a great many years, your grace, and sensible women do not surrender a hard-won peace on the strength of a single evening's honesty, however well meant. Larkspur is mine now, in every way that matters beyond the deed itself. I have tenants who depend upon me and a household that runs on my judgment rather than anyone else's, and I find, to my own surprise, that I do not wish to give that up merely because you have arrived at an inconvenient hour with an apology, however sincerely offered. I would not ask you to give it up," he said. "I would ask only for the chance to prove, over whatever time you require, that I am not the man who said what I said on those steps. I do not expect you to believe it tonight." "No," she agreed. "I do not believe it tonight. But I have not asked you to leave, either, and I think you may take what encouragement you like from that, and no more." He did not stay long after that, understanding, with an instinct he had not credited himself with possessing a season earlier, that to press further would undo whatever ground the evening had gained. And he took his leave with a bow that was, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily have named, entirely without formality, an honest inclination of the head from a man to a woman he had wronged, and hoped, without any guarantee, to be permitted to make amends to. At the door he paused, and said, "I saw your lamp from the Boundary Road on other evenings besides this one. I did not know, until tonight, that it was yours I was looking for." She said nothing to that, but she did not look away from him either, and when he had gone, and Fenwick had barred the door behind him, she sat a long while at the desk without returning to her ledger, watching the lamp burn down by careful degrees, and did not this time find the silence of the house entirely comfortable. For it seemed to her now not the settled, purposeful quiet she had built for herself over the autumn, but something more like a held breath, waiting to learn what shape the coming months would take. Peggy, who had said little through the whole of that strange autumn beyond what her duties required, ventured, as she brushed out her mistress's hair before bed that night, that she had never in 3 years seen his grace look at anyone the way he had looked at the Duchess across that office desk, lamp or no lamp, and that she, Peggy, had buried a husband of her own once, and knew the particular difference between a man performing regret and a man actually carrying it, and that whatever the Duchess decided to do with the knowledge, she thought it only honest to say she believed the second sort was standing in the drive not 2 hours past. Eleanor did not answer her directly, only asked that the lamp be trimmed and left burning a while longer than usual, and sat by the window a long time after Peggy had gone, watching the dark road toward Alderley, before she finally permitted herself to sleep. He returned to Alderley that night and gave orders, the following morning, that Mrs. Colfax's belongings were to be packed and her carriage made ready. And when she came to his study to demand an explanation, flushed with an anger that had not yet fully understood its own defeat, he gave her one, briefly and without cruelty, for he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he bore her no great animosity, only the flat clarity of a man who has finally set down a weight he had carried so long he had mistaken its shape for his own. "I have been unjust to 2 women on your account, Mrs. Colfax," he said, "though only one of them was ever entitled to my fidelity. I do not intend to compound the injustice further." She left within the hour, and society, which had already begun withdrawing its invitations, offered her the particular mercy of forgetting her within a season, a widow of independent means being, after all, a common enough figure to attract very little sustained attention once the scandal attached to her had cooled. What followed was not a swift reconciliation, for Eleanor had meant what she said about sensible women and hard-won peace, and Julian, to his credit, did not attempt to hurry her past her own caution. He did not call at Larkspur again for a fortnight, and when he did call it was in the daylight, with proper notice sent ahead, and he asked, that first visit, not for any renewal of intimacy, but only for permission to see the drainage works in the low fields, of which Cora had told him so much, and Eleanor, recognizing the request for the small offered olive branch it was, granted it, and walked the fields with him in her stout boots while he asked her sensible questions about the engineering of the thing, and did not once attempt to turn the conversation toward anything more personal than clay pipe and gravel bed. He called again the following week on a similar pretext, and the week after that, and by slow degrees over the whole of that winter. A pattern established itself that neither of them named aloud. He came once a week, sometimes twice, always with some practical reason. The boundary wall wanted repair, where a storm had brought a section of it down, and he sent his own men to mend it, and asked, when the work was done, whether a proper gate might be set into it where the old wired one had stood, so that the 2 estates' business, he said, might be conducted with rather less inconvenience to the parties concerned, a remark that made her smile despite herself, being so plainly about a great deal more than gates. Cora, of course, was in transports of quiet joy at these developments, though she had the wisdom, unusual in a child of 11, not to remark upon them too loudly for fear of frightening either party into retreat. She continued her weekly visits and reported that winter rather less news of drainage and rather more of her brother, who had taken, she said, to reading in the evenings by the same lamp Aunt Eleanor was said to favour, though Cora could not imagine what that had to do with anything, and asked Eleanor directly, one afternoon, by the nursery fire, whether she thought her brother had grown wiser since the autumn, or only quieter, to which Eleanor replied, with the careful honesty she had adopted toward the child from their first acquaintance, that she believed it might, in time, prove to be both, though time was the operative word, and not one she intended to hurry on anyone's account. Sir Edmund Locke, who had watched the boundary road grow busier with the Duke's comings and goings over that winter, with the clear-eyed resignation of a man who has understood, before the lady in question has fully admitted it to herself that his own suit was never likely to prosper. Called at Larkspur one bright, cold morning in February to take his leave of her properly. "I do not think you love me, your grace," he said, with the particular gentleness of a man for whom honesty costs something and is given anyway, though I have hoped, for a season, that you might come to. I think, rather, that you have begun to hope for something with your husband that I could never offer you, being no husband of yours at all. And I find I would rather see you happy in that than have you settle for my company out of some misplaced sense of loyalty to a friendship I have valued a great deal, more than I ought perhaps to admit." She took his hand and told him, with equal honesty, that his friendship had been one of the steadiest kindnesses of the hardest year of her life, and that she hoped it might continue on those terms, whatever else came of the spring, and he said that he hoped so too, and meant it, and there was in the parting none of the bitterness that so often attends a disappointed suit, only the quiet grace of a man who had understood his part in the story from very near its beginning, and had chosen to play it well regardless. It was in March, when the first green was coming up along the boundary wall and the new gate stood open more often than it stood shut, that Julian came to Larkspur one evening, not on any pretext of business at all, but simply, he said, because he found he no longer wished to invent one. He found her in the walled garden rather than the estate office, on her knees in the black spring earth, with Marigold the spaniel dozing beside her, setting out seedlings she had raised from her father's old garden at her mother's cottage, and he stood at the gate a long moment watching her before she noticed him, struck by the plain, unguarded contentment of her. A woman entirely at ease in a life she had built for herself out of the wreckage he had made of, the one he had offered her. "I have not come about the gate, or the wall, or the drainage," he said, when she looked up. "I have come only because I find I would rather be here than anywhere else this evening, and I no longer see any reason to disguise that as business." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, guarded still but no longer entirely closed, softened by careful degrees, the way frost gives way to a morning sun it has not yet decided to trust completely. "That is the first thing you have said to me all winter," she said. That was not, in some fashion, about offence. "No," he agreed, and came through the gate to sit on the low stone bench at the garden's edge, close enough to speak without raising his voice, not so close as to crowd her. "I have thought, this winter, a great deal about what I might say to you that would be worth more than another fence, and I confess I have not landed upon anything so eloquent as I would like. I have only this." He drew from his coat a folded paper, sealed and formal, and held it out to her. And when she took it and broke the seal with earth-stained fingers, she found it to be the deed to Larkspur Hall, made over to her outright, in her own name, without reservation or reversion, a document her solicitor would later tell her was so cleanly and completely drawn that no court in England could ever compel her to surrender the property to him, or to any heir of his, come what may between them. "It was already yours in the sense that mattered," he said before she could speak, "but I wished it to be yours in every sense the law allows, so that whatever you decide of me, you need never again wonder whether you hold this place, or anything in your life, at another's pleasure. I would rather you choose me with a full hand than accept me for want of any other. I have had enough this winter of being loved out of necessity rather than choice. I imagine you have had rather more than enough of it than I." She sat with the paper a long moment, and when she looked up her eyes were bright in a way she did not attempt to disguise. "This is not a declaration," she said, half a question. "No?" He agreed again. "I have not the right to make one yet, and would not trust it if I did, coming so soon on the heels of everything I have to atone for. It is only proof, I hope, that I have understood something true about you at last, which is that you have never once in 3 years asked to be given anything you had not first earned with your own labour, and I thought it past time that something be given to you freely, and without any claim attached to it at all. And if I choose, having read it, to remain here and never return to Alderley?" she asked, testing the ground the way she had tested every ground that winter carefully before committing her weight to it. "Then I will have lost the better part of my life through my own folly," he said, "and I will have no one to blame for it but myself. And I will, I think, go on riding this boundary road of an evening regardless, because I find I have grown fonder of the sight of your lamp in that window than of anything in my own house, whether or not I am ever again permitted past your gate." It was, she would tell Peggy much later, the closest thing to poetry she had ever heard him speak, precisely because he had not been trying to speak it. She did not answer him that evening, beyond thanking him, with careful formality, for the deed, and he did not press her, understanding by now the shape of her caution well enough to know that pressing would cost him more than patience ever could. But he came again the following week, and the week after, no longer troubling to invent reasons of fence or ditch, simply arriving in the late afternoon and staying to walk the garden with her, or to sit with her and Cora by the nursery fire when his sister's visits coincided with his own. And by these small, undramatic increments, a second courtship built itself atop the ruins of the first. One conducted not in ballrooms and settlements, but in mud-stained boots and long, unhurried evenings, until one evening in April, walking the low fields where the drainage works had held through a full season of rain and the tenant cottages stood dry for the first time in a decade, she stopped at the gate that marked the boundary between their two lands, and said, without any great ceremony, "I find I no longer think of this as your land and mine, Julian, but simply as the land." And he understood, hearing his given name from her for the first time since their wedding, exactly what she had chosen to tell him, and did not trust himself to answer with anything more than her own name in return, Eleanor, which was, between two people who had learned the hard way what plain words could cost and what they could also mend, declaration enough. She did not move back to Alderley at once, even then, for she had learned too much that winter about the value of a thing held in one's own name to surrender the habit of independence merely because her heart had softened, and so it was agreed between them, in the practical fashion that had come to characterize their second courtship as much as their first marriage had lacked it, that Larkspur would remain hers in full, its accounts her own to keep, its tenants her own to answer to, and that she would divide her time between the two houses as she chose rather than as any settlement dictated. It was, Lady Ophelia observed to anyone who would listen, a most unconventional arrangement for a duchess and a most sensible one, and she took a not inconsiderable share of the credit for it, having been, as she reminded Julian at every opportunity that summer, the one who had told him plainly what he had been too much a fool to see for himself. By midsummer, Eleanor's rooms at Alderley, shut up so long, stood open again, their shelves once more lined with account books, their vase once more filled. though now she filled it herself with whatever the Larkspur Gardens had sent over that week by way of her own gardener, a standing arrangement between the two households that pleased her more than any grander gift could have done. Mr. Pruitt, observing the return of the Duchess's chair to regular use at the foot of the long table, permitted himself, for the first time in 32 years of careful service, a private smile that lasted the better part of an afternoon. Cora, who had watched the whole slow architecture of the reconciliation with the proprietary satisfaction of a child who believes, not entirely without justification, that her own reports had done a good deal to bring it about, declared herself vindicated on every point, and took to visiting Larkspur and Alderley with equal frequency, as though the boundary between them had ceased to signify at all, which by autumn it very nearly had, the new gate standing open from dawn until dusk, and the path between the two gardens worn smooth by regular use. Marigold the spaniel divided her loyalties between both households with the untroubled diplomacy of a dog who has never once been asked to choose. Of Mrs. Colfax, little more was heard. She was said, by the following spring, to have married a wealthy merchant in Bath. A match society received with the mild, already forgetting interest it generally reserves for matters no longer capable of scandal, and neither Julian nor Eleanor found occasion to think of her often, she having become, by slow and welcome degrees, a smaller feature of their history than either of them would once have believed possible. It was the following October, a full year almost to the week since the evening at Lindenhurst House, that the Duke and Duchess of Alderley returned to the very same ballroom for the Duchess of Reresby's autumn ball, an occasion Eleanor had very nearly declined until Julian, with a look she had come to recognise as the particular seriousness he reserved for things that mattered to him a great deal more than his easy manner generally let on, asked her to attend with him regardless, saying only that he had unfinished business upon those steps that a year's absence had not settled. She wore green again, though a finer green this time, and her own maid had sewn seed pearls along the hem in a pattern of climbing vines that echoed, deliberately, the drainage patterns of the low fields. A private joke between herself and Peggy that no one else in the ballroom would ever understand, and that pleased her more than any more conventional ornament could have done. The carriage drew up before the same lantern steps, and Julian handed her down himself, and as they climbed together toward the wide-open doors, where a line of guests still arriving pressed close upon the stair, he did not walk ahead of her, nor beside her exactly, but drew her hand more firmly through his arm, and said, in a voice pitched, quite deliberately, to carry to the small knot of guests who had turned, as such knots of guests inevitably do at the arrival of a Duke and Duchess whose history the whole county still discussed in careful whispers. Make way, if you would be so good, for the Duchess of Alderley, and stepped himself half a pace behind her, so that it was she who crossed the threshold first, into the light and the noise and the waiting room beyond, while he followed, watching her go before him with the plain, unguarded pride of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, exactly whom a house ought to be arranged around. She paused just inside the door, glancing back at him over her shoulder with an expression that held in equal measure amusement and something a good deal warmer than amusement, and said, low enough that only he could hear it, "That was better managed than your last attempt at these steps, your Grace." "I have had a year of practice," he said, "in learning who is owed the room. Lady Ophelia, observing the exchange from a discreet distance with the satisfied air of a woman who considers a long campaign successfully concluded, remarked to no one in particular that it was about time, and turned her attention to the punch table, well pleased with the evening and with herself. Cora, who had been permitted, as a great treat, to stay up late enough to see her brother and sister off before the ball, would hear the story the next morning from Peggy, who had it from the coachman, and would repeat it, with considerable embellishment, to anyone at Alderley who would listen, until it passed, by the following spring, into the settled and cherished mythology of the household. The story of the evening the Duke of Alderley learned at last precisely where his wife belonged, which was not behind him stepping aside, but beside him, or, when the room required it, a half-step ahead, with the whole of his attention and the whole of his loyalty, following faithfully after her exactly as it should have from the very first. By the following spring, the lamp still burned some evenings in the estate office window at Larkspur, though now it burned as often for two readers bent together over the same ledger as for one, and the boundary gate between the two properties, hinges well oiled from a year's constant use, was never shut at all, the two estates having long since ceased to require any such distinction between what was his land and what was hers, there being by then only the land, and the house and the marriage tended now with the same patient, unglamorous faithfulness she had once given alone to a garden no one else had thought worth the labour, and that he had at last learned to tend beside her.